the way that we talk about leadership now has just shifted so much. 10, 15 years ago, it was command and control. And now it's vulnerable leadership, compassionate leadership, coaching, all these different ways. And especially for women, there's different ways that we have to lead because we're judged differently in leadership. But understanding why you are the way you are, you're not broken. There's nothing wrong, just is. There's no blame. That's the big thing, is like all this has to be very non-judgmental and curious. But like, wow, look, this is amazing. Is there another way that I can like start living my life?
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel if you're new here. We have the lovely Dr. Stephanie Byerly here with us today. She is an obstetrical anesthesiologist, a woman empowerment and leadership coach, and she does trauma-informed coaching. Today, we are going to be talking about women in leadership, but before we do, Stephanie, can you please tell us a little bit more about who you are?
Yes. Hi, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Jillian. I live in Texas, and I was in academic medicine for 25 years and recently decided to leave academics, sort of did it all, and thought it's time for me to do something else in medicine so that I can pursue my coaching more. And so I'm very fortunate. I get to do only obstetrical anesthesia, which I love. I get to take care of pregnant women. And I have my own coaching business, and work with women, work with men, and love to coach about the patriarchy and women and how we are held back and socialized, but also helping us get out of our own way. But really talking about leadership and what holds us back in leadership, because we need women in leadership. We have to have women in leadership.
Yeah, and for just kind of baseline definition, how would we define leadership?
I think there's a lot of different ways to define leadership, but leadership, with the way that I like to sort of envision it, is that you are the visionary for the team. You are not supposed to have all the answers, but you're supposed to create a psychologically safe team where there's trust and there's commitment, and people feel that they can come to you, they can make mistakes, they can bring ideas, they can let you know sort of what's going on in their life, because as we know now, life happens to people. And we form connection and we form trust, and we set the vision, and we empower people to bring their best selves to the team, and then we create the results.
I love how you define a leader, right? Because we have people in leadership positions, but they aren't necessarily demonstrating the attributes that you just listed up. And so we need to separate people in leadership titles, true leaders, and understand at an individual level, like that leader that you define is like, it starts with us and identifying how are we leading our own lives. And then when you start to lead others, you're going to lead them the same way you're leading your own life, and vice versa. I really love how you define leadership.
Oh, thank you. I think people get put in leadership roles with no training, and I think that's especially evident in medicine. Someone sees that you have talent or potential as a leader, and we get put in roles, but there's not a lot of born leaders. Like people have this misconception that people are just born to be leaders. Well, some people are, and you may have that propensity, but leadership really is learning and unlearning and relearning and learning, because the way that we talk about leadership now has just shifted so much. 10, 15 years ago, it was command and control, and now it's vulnerable leadership, compassionate leadership, coaching, all these different ways. And especially for women, there's different ways that we have to lead because we're judged differently in leadership.
And I think even before we get judged, I think knowing that people get judged, I love that we're going to have this discussion today and help people understand what to do about it, because there's kind of this paralysis when people are considering getting into a leadership position because they already kind of have an idea of what they're up against, which becomes the obstacle, right? Like, I'm just going to keep myself small because I don't want to have to navigate all these perceived obstacles. in front of me. So I love that you empower women so that when they do come into contact with all of these obstacles that we know exist, is they have the tools and to find the other supporters. There's male allies and of course
Mm-hmm.
women. And we know from experience that just because we're of the same gender doesn't mean that's going to be your ally.
Absolutely. That is definitely the truth. And when women start to understand, through coaching, that our self-concept is really, it's so interesting of what's going on in our brains. And there's usually a common thread in every area of our life of like these inner barriers that we have. And there's common patterns that we have. I did some coaching training with someone named Dr. Claire Zaman. She's identified 21 basically patterns that women fall into. And a lot of it has to do with I'm not enough, or I'm going to be alone, or, all these things. And if we start to understand that 80% of the barriers, like the inner glass ceiling, because we always talk about the glass ceiling, right? That's the outer glass ceiling. Those are the objective things that we face, which are absolutely true. But 80% of what holds us back is the inner barriers. And if we can start to understand that, not from a place of I'm broken, I'm not enough, it's sort of like, well, this is where we are. And of course it's like this, but we start to look at it non-judgmentally and figure out how you want to move forward so it doesn't continue to affect you in this way.
Yeah, I like to think about reflecting with compassionate curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
I feel most people in medicine lack self-compassion.
Yeah.
And then the high self-critic, it's if you shift, and I love, you have a coaching mindset, you're a coach. It's like coaching often is coming from a place of curiosity. And if we can translate that into our own inner dialogue and say, well, I don't think I can do that, or I don't have the skills to do that. I wonder why I think that, or I wonder why I did that or do that. So much different than that spiral, isn't it?
It is, because if women, first of all, knew how they were socialized, as women were socialized basically from the day we're born. And part of it is our epigenetics too. So our family lines, or just even the collective of women or different, populations of people, we have our epigenetics that's in there. And then our family of origin, and how we see TV, social media, all the things now, like, it's always in front of us now. So we're socialized with all these things coming at us, and we're taught to believe as women that we're not worthy and that we shouldn't have an opinion of ourselves because we're not worthy enough to have that we need to be validated by other people. They're supposed to help us make our opinion of ourselves. Whatever they think about us is what we're supposed to internalize, and we're supposed to take care of everybody else. And if you take care of yourself, you're selfish. And, we should be sacrificing ourselves for everyone. We're not good decision makers. We're not good leaders. We're not good with money. I mean, the list goes on and on. And then we become physicians where we're trained by guilt and shame, and we're trained that we shouldn't have feelings, just do it. Go move on to the next thing. Don't process anything that you just saw or just happened. And we're supposed to, again, sacrifice ourselves for everybody else. Women physicians, there's a whole nother, we know we get paid less for the most part. We get promoted less. We get less papers published. We get less grants. People call you by your first name. People make comments about your body. I mean, it just goes on and on. So there's like 3 levels of marginalization. And if you're a woman of color, or if you have any of the isms, anything that causes you to be othered, ageism or chronic illness or neurodiversity, I mean, all these things just build up, and it's more and more levels of this negative talk.
I'm feeling like, as you're saying this, I have this. Okay, when we talk about trauma, okay, all these examples coming into our head. And, when we talk about trauma, there's the big T trauma and the little T trauma. And I feel it's underappreciated, the impact of having all of these things happen to somebody. And as you said, that we're told not to process. When you are not able to get your processing out, it turns inward, and that inward becomes illness, becomes mental illness, physical illness. And so you do trauma-informed coaching, and I'm
Mhm.
curious to hear more about that and how it weaves into what you were just mentioning about what we experience.
So I love to explain to, I guess, everyone who will listen, not just my coaching clients, but I love to talk about trauma because I think the reason is because I never understood how my traumas impacted me. And I was like, why am I such a reactive person? Why do I have anxiety? Like, why? And, learning about trauma has just changed my life. But what people need to realize is all this information is new. Like all the neuroscience has been exploding over the last 5 years and continues to explode. But it helps you understand why you are the way you are. And if traumas that you experienced by the time you were 7 years old are baked into your nervous system, it helps you realize that you are the way you are because of things that you processed as a kid with a brain that couldn't make sense of anything and internalized it. And maybe sometimes you were in real danger or perceived danger, and how our nervous system is affected. So one of the women that I work with, she's an amazing woman, Dr. Kimia Saraf. I just love this. She says that trauma is not a memory, but it's a reaction. And so our bodies have these physiologic reactions to things around us that we don't necessarily like say, oh, I'm fearful, but our body is responding because there is a memory in your nervous system. And there's several definitions of trauma, but Dr. Gabor Mate says it's not what happened to you, but it's what happened inside of you because of what happened to you. Mm-hmm. And so the body keeps the score, right? And trauma lives in our tissues. And they know now, like most basically autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis are caused by unprocessed trauma. They know so many chronic diseases are processed by unprocessed trauma. And if you look at ACEs scores, have you ever heard of that? The adverse childhood. So when I took my ACEs score, I was like, oh my God, my score is an 8. I said yes to pretty much everything on there. Gosh. But if you had just one person in your life during the time that was happening that you felt connected to, it helps to mitigate their responses or what happens, because they know now the people who have higher ACEs scores have higher incidence of chronic illnesses. But if there was at least one person there during those times to validate you, mm-hmm. It helps to not have that be baked into your nervous system as much. But the issue is that little t's, big T's, like we talk about, two people could experience the same trauma and have it completely different to be affected by it with their nervous system. It's also the effect of cumulative traumas. And so, in medicine, we see so much secondary trauma. We see primary, it could happen to us, but we see our patients, or we hear things that our patients tell us. And it's that limbic resonance where it's almost like we're experiencing the trauma with them because we're connected in a way because of our humanness. And so, you come to the table, you get a leadership role, right? But you don't understand like why you show up the way you show up, and when you can start to understand the playing field of what's holding me back with these inner barriers, what has my trauma done? And we don't excavate the trauma. We want to say, how is it affecting you? How do you want to work with this going forward? But understanding why you are the way you are. You're not broken. There's nothing wrong. It just is. There's no blame. That's the big thing, is like all this has to be very non-judgmental and curious. But like, wow, look, this is amazing. Is there another way that I can like start living my life now, understanding that, oh my God, even with all of this, look where I am. Look, my gosh, it's freeing. Mm-hmm. It really is freeing. And there's people who come to the table with leadership who've had trauma, but then there's also the trauma of leadership. And so lots of things that happen to women in leadership, we get passed over for promotions. We don't negotiate well. We get talked over in meetings. You could present an idea and then someone else presents your idea. So many things it's almost like we have to work harder, and a lot of that, it's absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
But when you understand that that makes you start to shrink a little bit, and that you actually develop trauma responses, and like it's either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn.
Mm-hmm.
And fawn is like people pleasing, giving in, just doing whatever you have to do to survive. That's what we fall into. And so we have these responses that we don't even understand, because we don't choose the way that our nervous system responds. Like you may be a fight, you may be flight, freeze or fawn, and that's sort of what happens. And you were like, why did I just do that? Why did I just say that? Why am I so anxious? But it's an interplay of the inner barriers, like I'm not good enough, I'm always doing something wrong. You get an email that your boss needs to talk to you, and you're like, oh my God, I'm getting fired. Right? The immediate response is, so it's starting to understand all these pieces and being like, oh my God, I can get control back.
Mm-hmm. Having that sense of agency is so important. I feel like what you were demonstrating and saying with making yourself small, the moment that we give into that and comply, we have this learned helplessness. And that could just perpetuate all the problems you were saying, the mental health aspects, the physical ailments, and increase the likelihood that you won't overcome the obstacles put before you. And then that kind of creates that cyclical, oh well, then see, here's the example of where I didn't get promoted, and like you create more examples, and it's that self-fulfilling,
your brain just looks for evidence because it is a meaning making machine. But really the only reason it's doing that is because it's hardwired to look for danger. And so it's trying to be like, am I in danger? What kind of story can I create? What evidence can I look for that we're either safe or we're in danger? And that's like it. And when you start to realize that, like, we're these advanced humans, but literally our nervous system is just like, are we safe or not? And for women, we're sort of not safe in general. Like when we think about, a lot of different aspects of being a woman, but it's just really fascinating when you start realizing, like, it's not black and white. Like there's a lot of pieces, but how do we start, digging at one piece and teasing it out? Because usually the core inner, like the inner barriers is what is affecting every part of your life. So we start to identify what that is, and the sort of the traumas associated with that as well. Because whenever you've had trauma, it shifts things to another level. Our different parts of our brain are more active when you've had trauma, and we don't necessarily are always functioning from our prefrontal cortex. Sometimes our amygdala is taken over and our brain gets hijacked. And it can literally, for a person who understands trauma, they say like the shortest amount of time that it can take to get yourself out of a trauma response is like 17 minutes. And that's if you're skilled at understanding what's happening in your body. So there's like we have to start again from a very curious, non-judgmental place, like, oh my gosh, this is amazing.
Yeah, it's important to ask yourself, what's coming up for me here? Because what happens is that we'll notice we're having a disproportional response to whatever the circumstances, and we can be judgmental, or the people around you. Like if you start tearing up or having like an anxiety attack, but it doesn't fit the context, but something matters. Like that happens to me a lot. And like, oh, what's coming up for you? I have a therapist, and I'm figuring out my next job, and there are a lot of people. I have a dental license, but I'm looking to go into psychiatry, so I'm like, I don't know, how much do I actually want to use this, and I've been avoidant. And he goes, well, how much of it's because you're truly not interested? Because I developed pretty intense PTSD symptoms after all my oral surgery. Like it wasn't oral surgery, it was what happened with developing suicidal ideation, with losing my ex-boyfriend, with having a severe illness. Like all of those happened when I was doing that job. So I associate all things dentistry and clinical with those experiences. And I've been trying to tease apart, well, what is going on? Like if I could regulate my nervous system, would I still want to do that? But fortunately for me, before I developed those reactions, I kind of had an idea that I wanted to pursue mental health stuff. So I was like, okay, but it's hard to tease that apart. But people get mad at themselves or judgmental when like they're, they come home from work, there's so much they're carrying, and their kid didn't pick something up or something, and then they blow up. And then
Yeah.
they're judging themselves for blowing up because it was something microscopic in their mind, but yet it wasn't, because it was everything else. And that
Mhm.
was just the moment where it all came out.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is that we don't take care of ourselves, because there's, always that belief that we're not supposed to be taking care of ourselves. And so particularly for women, we've been taught that boundaries are unacceptable, and that if we are set boundaries, we're like too much, or who do you think you are? And so we just push ourselves to the brink, and one more thing happens and we just lose it, and we get asked to do things. There's expectations put on us that don't get put on men. And if you're in a medical office, say, and there's a male and a female partner, the office staff are usually not going to go to the male partner and say, can you get the Christmas gifts for the staff, or can you just fit in one extra patient today, because and they just sort of know how to get to you and get to those beliefs about yourself that you should just take care of everybody else. And so it's starting to understand what's going on in your brain, because if we're having 40 to 60,000 thoughts a day and 95% of them are subconscious, imagine what's going on in there. They're like running wild.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you start to understand what's going on, then you're like, okay, now I understand, a different place I'm coming from. How do I want to start showing up intentionally when I start to say, I'm no longer willing to put up with this?
I love that. And identifying what you were saying, how we were socialized and the role for certain things, like smaller because there's a threat, right? And a lot of that threat could be because someone's judgment's coming at you because you're not acting the way that you were supposed to based off of societal standards. And some of
Right.
it's, when you were a child and you couldn't defend yourself, then
Yeah.
some of those things with self-worth or people pleasing to keep yourself safe, like there was a role, or even self-judgment has a role when it comes to keeping yourself safe when you're younger. I was reading, it's in Fierce Self-Compassion by Kristen Neff, talks about that, and how,
Yeah.
it's easy to say, oh, develop self-compassion, but people who were feeling in danger when they were young, like we could feel averse to developing self-compassion. It's so abnormal, but getting to know yourself, and that's, the combination of therapy, doing the back, kind of the backside analysis. And then, I feel like the coaching meets you when you feel that you're able to be fully present and then move forward. But I like how you showcased the role of the certain things that we do, such as the people pleasing and the lack of boundaries. But how does the lack of boundaries impact us?
So, what it does is it just allows us to say yes to everything, and we never say no. And especially for women, what we do, instead of feeling guilt and shame, because that's what women do, is we pretty much process guilt and shame. We would rather resent doing something rather than feel bad about not doing it. And so we just do it, right? And we cannot say no. Now, there is a caveat to that, is that sometimes when we do say no, we're judged way more harshly, and there's a lot of backlash. But when you actually can set boundaries, which is an act of self-love and self-compassion, it's like exquisite self-love, because you start to actually believe that you can have boundaries. Then you start showing up very differently, because you don't judge everybody else's reaction that it means something about you. Like if you're sitting in a meeting, right, and you're looking at all the people's faces and people don't look happy, or they look upset with you, or you're like, oh my God, what did I do? What did I say? It usually isn't about us, but we make it about us. So when you start to realize, if they're not happy with me, but I'm showing up the way I'd like to as a leader, not my problem. It just is, and so we start to realize that we can have boundaries, and then it starts to build. Like you start setting a boundary in one part of your life, and you're like, hey, I got some control and I feel pretty empowered. Now I'm going to start doing it over here, because you get the confidence and the self-confidence because you just did it over here. So self-confidence is really based on, well, I did it here, I can do it now. And it just gets more and more and more and more and more. And you just start to realize that you have no control over what anybody else is thinking or feeling about you, as long as you're showing up the way you want to be showing up. And not 100% of the time, because we're not perfect, but you have no control over other people, only yourself.
And people who have an agenda for you and you're not compliant with that because you set boundaries, they will get mad, but they had
Oh,
an
yeah.
agenda for you, right? So it's expecting that there are going to be probably a lot of people that do get angry because you're not meeting the need that they wanted you to meet, but that's also
Mm-hmm.
okay. People can be mad at you. Let them
Mm-hmm.
be mad at you. And also, it's important for us to model boundaries for other people, because what happens is that if no one, say you're leading, you don't set boundaries, but you say, I don't have a good work-life balance, but you should.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're not going to take
Right.
that verbal message. They're going to feel the experience and the pressure that you are modeling. It's compassionate.
Absolutely.
It's such a gift to the mentees and all those in your environment to demonstrate that we care about you holistically. And in
Mm-hmm.
order to be compassionate to self and others, we need firm boundaries. I was at a talk with Brene Brown, and she said, my favorite things from her talk were that in her research, she found that the people with the highest levels of mental toughness at their core was self-compassion, and that the people who were able to consistently give compassion to others had firm
Yeah.
boundaries.
Yeah. You have to have it with yourself first in order to do it with other people. But like you said, when you're young and you are in an unsafe place, and like your brain development sort of stops there at that age. And you have to remember that. So we process things as a kid that we're still living out today from a brain of a 5, 6, 7, whatever year old. And so again, this trauma response is very real, and we function from a very, very, very different level. But as you said, for boundaries, like if you're a leader and you tell your employees, oh, don't worry about answering emails 24/7, but you're sending emails 24/7, and then you're like texting them like, why didn't you read my email? Or if you say, oh, you should be having work-life I like the term work-life boundaries, and then expect that you're working 24/7 and they're not modeling resting. There's no congruence there. There's that cognitive dissonance of like, oh, she's saying that, or he's saying that, but that's not what they want us to do, right? So it's sort of like actions speak louder than words in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So leadership though is so different now though than it used to be. And again, a lot of people get put in leadership roles without any formal training. And there really is a lot of learning and unlearning associated with leadership. And depending on how you show up, like on the DISC profile, I'm a D, I'm a high D, and there's not a lot of women who are Ds. And I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. I am the challenger. A lot of great things about that. But as a leader, you can squash people, because if they're not meeting your expectations and they're not moving fast enough for you, and there's not a lot of human connection because you're so task focused, that you just suck the life out of them, and then they have no motivation to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very important to learn like self-awareness. Most of us don't have any idea of how we're showing up. We think we know, but we don't know. And so there's so many different pieces of this about how you get to know who you are. Who do you want to be? Because leadership's learned. Most of it's learned. And being able to say, you know what, I don't know who my authentic self is, but guess what? Now I get to figure it out, and I get to decide going forward who my authentic self is. Because my identity is not, I'm a doctor, I'm a mother, I'm a leader, I'm this. My identity is like the 8 C's that Dick Schwartz talks about in internal family systems: the calm, confident, compassionate, curious, all these different things. Like that's our identity. It just, we get into our socialized identities and we lose so much of that.
Yeah. Martha Beck calls it the essential self and the social self. And
Yeah.
we sacrifice so much of our essential self. And in her book, The Way of Integrity, she talks about, again, the manifestation is similar to the trauma experience. If you're living out of alignment with your core self, your core values and your essential self, you're going to know
Yes. Yeah.
it.
And you know what? I think our values change in different parts of our lives. Because
Definitely.
when you're making decisions as like an 18 or 20-year-old, and you think, our brains aren't even fully formed yet. Now I think it's like 26 or 27.
Yeah.
And so our values change. And, but if you're not aligned with what your values are, yeah, we know we're out of integrity. We feel that yucky, just like, why do I feel this way? Keep searching for something to make you happy. Doesn't have to be that way anymore. You can be different.
I just read the book Happier by Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar.
Yeah.
Have you read it?
Yeah. I have not, but I've heard about it.
It's good. I'm currently reading this is the Build the Life You Want. It's The Art and Science of Getting Happier by Arthur
Nice.
Brooks and Oprah Winfrey. It's fascinating because it talks about happiness is not a destination. You can get happier, but you can't be happy. Like, it's not an outcome that you consistently can just stay happy, and you shouldn't want to, it talks about. And it's interesting.
Yeah. She has another great book. Have you ever read What Happened to You
I
by
haven't,
Oprah
so
Winfrey and
I
Dr. Bruce
should.
Perry? Oh my God. If you want to learn like trauma in like very explained in a beautiful way, and the storytelling, because storytelling really helps you understand the stories. You're just like, wow. Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
I was trying to get through Dr. Gabor Mate's book, and it's like,
Mhm.
oh my gosh. But I like the storytelling one because Dr. Mate's book is so dense. So, it's
Yeah.
a lot of the research that he did. So I'm going to have to get
Yeah.
the one that you said.
And The Body Keeps the Score. That's another great one by Bessel van der Kolk. Great book.
Yeah, everyone recommends that one. I've heard
Mhm.
some interesting things about the authors, so I always do I read it or not, but I heard the book is really good. So we're
Yeah,
gonna have
it really explains a lot.
all these great resources to tie into the things that you were saying. And for people who are identifying, it's you sit here and we have all these thoughts flying in our head. What do you perceive as the best way to really understand ourselves?
So I think you have to go to the basics of like what's happening on a daily basis. So when you start to learn, okay, if I have 40 to 60,000 thoughts a day, which when I first heard that blew my mind. But you realize if 95% of those are even out of your consciousness, and I don't even think 5% are in our consciousness, right? Because we have the same thoughts every day.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
focus
I
on
wish
our
I
brain
didn't.
has, it's the
Yeah.
same negative thoughts every day. But to slow down, I think one of the main things is the pause. And to realize, okay, my brain is very, very powerful, but it's leading my life. Like every result that I have in my life is based on thoughts. And so most of the thoughts are stories. When I finally was like, okay, I think this is true, most of the things I believe are stories, because our brain is making stories to look for evidence about meaning, safe, unsafe, build a story to prove or disprove that you're safe or not. And so if you start to slow down and be like, okay, let me think about this. Is this a fact? Is this a story? Am I reacting, like you said, out of proportion to what's going on? What else is going on in my brain? Because there's usually not one thought, there's usually so many.
Yeah.
And it's like, is there another way I can look at this?
I like that question. Is there another way I can look
is there
at
another, like,
Yeah.
how else could I look at this? And sometimes there's no other way to look at it, because your thought is going to lead to a feeling, an emotion, and we think we have 5 emotions, but we have hundreds.
Yeah, so
But
many.
our emotions or feelings lead to our actions or inactions and behaviors, and then we get our results. But if we can start to say, let me slow down, that's the magic. Because if there's a quote, and I love this quote, and it's basically like, our power as a human being lies in the pause between stimulus and response. That's where our power comes from. We can start to slow down and stop moving so fast, because that's all we're doing. We're in this hustle culture. And especially for women, it's like everyone's in a hustle culture, everybody's in a productivity culture, but we not only a lot of times get our validation from that hustle, but then what happens is we are totally disconnected from ourselves.
Yeah.
We're living in some otherness, and we're not in our true authentic self, and we're so disconnected. And so, because slowing down actually a lot of times makes us anxious.
Oh, totally does.
Right? Because we're in that
Totally.
used to this.
Yeah.
We slow down and our nervous system's like, what are you doing? And so but it's easier for us, like for me, buffering or a way to get rid of like negative emotions is overworking.
Me too. I just
Oh
had
my
this
God.
conversation. The more anxious I am, the more likely I'm to add the pause is perfect for this, right? It's so perfect because when you want to add something else to your plate, take that pause and ask why. When I'm super anxious,
Right.
I create more and more tasks for myself.
Well, it's a distraction, right? And your
Oh,
brain is also
yeah.
telling you do something to make me feel better, like get a dopamine hit. Some people get on social media, eat, drink, overwork out. I mean, and here we are telling, right? We're telling ourselves, oh, I'm doing something
Oh,
so
the
good for
workout
myself.
feels great,
That
though. It
feels
does.
great. And it does, but we have to like really slow down and allow
Hmm.
all the thoughts, all the emotions. We're not supposed to feel great all the time, like you said.
No.
Like life is not always supposed to be great, and there's so much toxic positivity now. Like, well, you need to find the positive and be grateful for that. Okay, yeah, I practice gratitude every day, but sometimes bad things happen, or I just don't feel great today, and I'm
Mhm.
gonna not get stuck in it, but I'm gonna allow it, and it's the full human experience.
Validation is so important. What happens when
Mhm.
people are in toxic positivity, or, we were talking about both the external and internal barriers. We want to validate the external barriers are absolutely true,
Absolutely
right?
true.
And we use the internal discovery and understanding how we're responding to the external barriers. And is there a better way? Can we maneuver
Yeah,
around this differently where it doesn't
right.
impact us as much?
Right. And when you come from an empowered place of feeling confident about who you are and what you're doing, and you're thoughtful about what you're saying, and you don't react, like you respond. And that's not 100%, don't get me wrong, but going from slowing down and giving your brain a chance to process and then responding. And I used to be very reactive, like in leadership. I was a young leader. I didn't understand like why I was so reactive. And when I learned about all this, I was like, okay, I can take back some control. And I started showing up very differently. And I work in the operating room, and there's some really strong personalities. And they were like, wow, what's different about you? Because they couldn't get to me because I understood why I was responding the way that I was.
Hmm.
And then their behavior changed, but I
Love that.
started showing up, and it was never like confrontations in the operating room after that. It was always like, can we talk about this after? Like trying to not get involved in things in the heat of the moment. And I think it's very, in medicine now there's so much pressure, and not just medicine, but there is a lot of pressure on physicians and nurses and all of us in medicine. And it's very easy to get caught up in the victim mentality, and that everything's happening to you. And when you get back a sense of agency where you're choosing and you're taking back some control, everything starts to shift.
Hmm. Yeah, that agency, getting into the driver's seat and having hope,
Mm-hmm.
like it's just
Yes.
can just keep you going, and knowing like having your own agency, and also when you have the emotional intelligence and the capacity to take that step back and create that space. If you can't physically take that step back, like you can mentally and emotionally create
Mm-hmm.
that boundary, then
Yeah.
you develop your own psychological safety. Because in
Yes.
reactive environments, the physical safety and the emotional safety is compromised, and that you lose the trust that's so important. You were telling me about the foundation of leadership
Yeah.
and having trust at the core and at the foundation.
It's if you look at a pyramid, the result is at the top of the pyramid, and that's like what's above the water. Like if you think of it like an iceberg, but everything underneath the iceberg, the base is trust. And then it's like showing up consistently and being able to have a safe, psychologically safe team, but you have to have the trust. And the leader has to create that trust, but they have to trust themselves, but they also have to understand what creating a safe team means. It's like power shared. It isn't like you're the absolute leader. Leadership is just fascinating, but again, it's learning, unlearning, learning, unlearning. And there's very different ways that women lead, and there's so many reasons we have to be in leadership, different pieces of the puzzle that we bring to the table. There are so many studies that show the things that women excel at in leadership: communication, team building, making people feeling part of a team, making financial decisions. Women in general make better financial decisions, and we save companies that are in bankruptcy.
Wow.
And you need women on boards, you need diversity, you need different pieces to come together to sort of round out the masculine and the feminine energy, because we have both, we all have both, but sometimes one gets too over here, one gets over here, but it has to be, as a leader and a woman, that we don't forget the feminine pieces that we bring, because we're so much told that we're supposed to lead like a man and act like a man, and that is in such cognitive dissonance with what is going on inside our body.
Yes.
It really is, and we know that, and we're trying to fight it, so it's like this.
Yeah, when I was in oral surgery interviews, for the first interview, I was the only one without a black jacket. I came in with just a business shirt. And then for all the rest of them, I wore a black jacket. It was like, wow, we all masculinized ourselves in order to go through these interviews in a male dominated field. And I was in the Air Force, and I'm a tomboy. So like, I tend to lean towards heavier on the masculine side when it comes to not really expressing my femininity. But was that part of my, societal, the way I grew up? And I don't know. I think when I grew up, I already understood that women were oppressed and objectified. And part of my tomboy catering more towards the things that are more associated with males, I'm like, I wonder if that was a response to protect myself, or if it's part of my personality. This is a curious question. I don't know, not judging, just thinking about it. But my point was, like, when I was in that interview and reflecting on it, I did not feel like myself. I'm like, I don't like how I have to put on this mask. And when I was in surgery, and I'm really sensitive, and I got a lot of great feedback that we need, I hear this a lot from women surgeons that also are, sensitive, and they bring that into their surgery, where, oh, we need more people like you, but the environment often crushes people like us.
Absolutely.
Like, especially when we were told, like, I thought that being sensitive was such a weakness, and I was so vulnerable, and I didn't know how to create boundaries to protect myself. So I wanted to armor up. And that was so detrimental, because then the message that I was sending to myself and accepting was that who I am wasn't enough.
Right.
It wasn't desired. And it's only now, like, oh man, that feels like crap, by the way.
Well, it does, but then, okay, so when you're thinking that, your brain is actively looking for evidence to prove that.
Yeah.
And so it's like, oh, see, you can't do this right, and you're not good at this, and you're not good, and it's just this self-perpetuating. So the stories get to be bigger and bigger. And I'm obsessed with Tony Robbins, so I can't not finish this without mentioning Tony Robbins. But one of his famous quotes is, change your story, change your life. And it's just so, it's so true. We just have to sort of recognize, Tara Brach has this acronym RAIN, recognize, allow, investigate, nurture. When we talk about our thoughts lead to our feelings, actions, like, you combine all these things together and just think, like, what's my brain doing? Let me figure this out. Let me be curious. Let me non-judgmentally allow it all, but then I get to decide, like, I get to navigate how I want to go forward.
Yeah, in this book I mentioned, the Build the Life You Want, it talks about that. It talks about like, if we were to ask you to reflect on an experience, and then months later ask you to reflect on the same experience, like, you think you remembered it concretely, but it shifts because your brain creates new meaning from the experience over time. So it demonstrates how the meaning we create, as you just clearly expressed, is, what gives that circumstance its concreteness, even if it seems factual, but it's like, it's actually, it's not factual.
It's not fact, and but it becomes a neural pathway. It becomes like an automatic limiting sort of, belief. And, I would be remiss not to, mention again, if you're a person of color, or, LGBTQ, IA, if you're neurodiverse, all the things, like, it's just so much even more barriers. And to just realize that that people who have been marginalized to that extent come to the table with other things as well.
Yeah, I think that's the one key with the story comment that I always we need to be considerate about is like, we need to make sure that when things are true, we validate, right, ourselves that. And then if we can look at something another way, if that story is triggering, like sometimes if people, I express what exactly I think happened, and then what's the story you're telling yourself? I'm like, that's exactly,
Yeah,
it will trigger me inside. I'm like, that's exactly what happened. And so in those moments, it's like, okay, what meaning did you make? And kind of saying it maybe in a
yeah,
different way, but it has the same caliber of like trying to dissect what's true, how it impacted you, and how to
absolutely.
move
And
forward.
we talk too about socialization of women, but I love this because I love to talk to men, especially men that promote women into leadership, because they don't understand how they've been socialized, right?
Mhm.
Socialization doesn't only affect women, it affects men in a lot of ways too, right? I'm supposed to be strong, I'm not supposed to have feelings, I'm not supposed to show my emotions. But their thoughts about women in leadership are, we don't make good decisions, we're not good leaders, we're not good with money, we're of our bodies, we're not of our brain. So you could, and again, please don't take this like I'm saying this is okay, but you can imagine what's going on in their brain when you're talking in a meeting and giving an idea, and then they talk over you and give the same idea, because their brain is going, building a story, right? Or it's an automatic, she doesn't know what she's talking about.
Mhm.
So I'm not justifying it, but when you explain to men and they get this light bulb goes off and they're like, oh my God, like I had no idea. So it's really educating them too, so that they can be our allies. And then they're like, oh my God, I have a daughter, or I have a sister, or I have a wife, or I have, like I had no idea I was doing that, and so we have to work together. There's no man hating here. It's just more of like, this is where we are, people.
Yeah, it reminds me of that question, what's the difference between aggressive and assertive? The gender. It's
Yeah.
it is interesting. Well, you've shared so many tremendous things. Are there any last takeaways you want to share with the audience?
Just that, don't let your past rule your life now or going forward. We all have a past. We've all had things that have happened to us. We've all been traumatized in some way or another, especially now with, just seeing all the things we see 24/7, COVID, all the things. Do not just think that it can't be different, because it can. Obviously, if there's acute mental illness going on or a traumatic event, you have to get therapy for that. But coaching is magic, and coaching changed my life. I'll never be without a coach. And I just, it's like my passion going forward, because I love being an anesthesiologist and I love taking care of women, but I get to see them once or maybe twice if they come back for another delivery or something. But otherwise, when you're coaching, you help people change every day of their life. Like when I'm having conversations in my brain, or I'm about to have a conversation with someone, I'll pause first, right? And I'm doing that thought model, thoughts lead to feelings. And I'm like, do I really want to go down this pathway? Because I know what's going to happen. And I can do that magic pause. But it really, coaching is magic. I'm such a proponent of coaching. But there's options out there. Just don't stay stuck.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm a huge advocate for coaching as well, of course. And where can they find you?
Yes. My website is www.stephaniebyerly.com. And if you want to book a breakthrough session, that would be amazing.
Awesome.
And Stephanie Byerly, MD, at Facebook and Instagram, and the same for LinkedIn.
All right. Well, we'll make sure to have all the links in the show notes. Stephanie, thank you so much for being here. I am honored.
Thank you so much. Take care.